At the sound, the watchers simultaneously sprang to their feet. "You two go first," said the sergeant, addressing the uniformed men, who thereupon stole noiselessly, in their rubber-soled boots, down the stone stairs and along the pavement. The rest of us followed, with less attention to silence, and as we ran up to Thorndyke's chambers we were aware of quick but stealthy footsteps on the stairs above. "They've been at work, you see," whispered one of the constables, flashing his lantern onto the iron-bound outer door of our sitting-room, on which the marks of a large jemmy were plainly visible. The sergeant nodded grimly, and bidding the constables to remain on the landing, led the way upwards. As we ascended, faint rustlings continued to be audible from above, and on the second-floor landing we met a man descending briskly, but without hurry, from the third. It was Mr. Barton, and I could not but admire the composure with which he passed the two detectives. But suddenly his glance fell on Thorndyke, and his composure vanished. With a wild stare of incredulous horror, he halted as if petrified, then he broke away and raced furiously down the stairs, and after a moment a muffled shout and the sound of a scuffle told us that he had received a check. On the next flight we met two more men, who, more hurried and less self-possessed, endeavoured to push past, but the sergeant barred the way. "Why, bless me!" exclaimed the latter. "It's Moki, and isn't that Tom Harris?" "It's all right, Sergeant," said Moki plaintively, striving to escape from the officer's grip. "We've come to the wrong house, that's all." The sergeant smiled indulgently. "I know," he replied, "but you're always coming to the wrong house, Moki, and now you're just coming along with me to the right house." He slipped his hand inside his captive's coat and adroitly fished out a large folding jemmy, whereupon the discomforted burglar abandoned all further protest. On our return to the first floor, we found Mr. Barton sulkily awaiting us, handcuffed to one of the constables, and watched by Polton with pensive disapproval. "I needn't trouble you tonight, Doctor," said the sergeant, as he marshalled his little troop of captors and captives. "You'll hear from us in the morning. Good night, sir." The melancholy procession moved off down the stairs, and we retired to our chambers with Anstey to smoke a last pipe. "A capable man, that Barton," observed Thorndyke. "Ready, plausible, and ingenious, but spoilt by prolonged contact with fools. I wonder if the police will perceive the significance of this little affair." "They'll be more acute than I am if they do," said I. "Naturally," interposed Anstey, who loved to cheek his revered senior, "because there isn't any. It's only Thorndyke's bounce. He is really in a deuce of a fog himself." However this may have been, the police were a good deal puzzled by the incident, for, on the following morning, we received a visit from no less a person than Superintendent Miller of Scotland Yard. "This is a queer business," said he, coming to the point at once. "This burglary, I mean. Why should they want to crack your place? Right here in the Temple, too. You've got nothing of value here, have you? No hard stuff, as they call it, for instance?" "Not so much as a silver teaspoon," replied Thorndyke, who had a conscientious objection to plate of all kinds. "It's odd," said the superintendent. "Deuced odd. When we got your note, we thought that anarchist idiots had mixed you up with the case. You saw the papers, I suppose, and wanted to go through your rooms for some reason. We thought we had our hands on the gang, instead of which we find a party of common crooks that we're sick of the sight of. I tell you, sir, it's annoying, when you think you've hooked a salmon, to bring up a blooming eel." "It must be a great disappointment," Thorndyke agreed, suppressing a smile. "It is," said the detective. "Not but what we're glad enough to get these beggars, especially Halkett, or Barton as he calls himself. A mighty slippery customer is Halkett, and mischievous too. But we're not wanting any disappointments just now. There was that big jewel job in Piccadilly, Taplin and Horns. I don't mind telling you that we've not got a ghost of the clue. Then there's this anarchist affair. We're all in the dark there, too." "But what about the cipher?" asked Thorndyke. "Oh, hang the cipher!" exclaimed the detective irritably. "This Professor Popplebaum may be a very learned man, but he doesn't help us much. He says the document is in Hebrew, and he has translated it into Double Dutch. Just listen to this." He dragged out of his pocket a bundle of papers, and dabbing down a photograph of the document before Thorndyke, commenced to read the professor's report. "The document is written in the characters of the well-known inscription of Mesha, king of Moab. Who the devil's he? Never heard of him. Well known indeed. The language is Hebrew, and the words are separated by groups of letters which are meaningless and obviously introduced to mislead and confuse the reader. The words themselves are not strictly consecutive, but by the interpolation of certain other words, a series of intelligible sentences is obtained, the meaning of which is not very clear, but is no doubt allegorical. The method of decipherment is shown in the accompanying tables, and the full rendering suggested on the enclosed sheet. It is to be noted that the writer of this document was apparently quite unacquainted with the Hebrew language, as appears from the absence of any grammatical construction. That's the professor's report, Doctor, and here are the tables showing how he worked it out. It makes my head spin to look at 'em." He handed to Thorndyke a bundle of ruled sheets, which my colleague examined attentively for a while and then passed on to me. "This is very systematic and thorough," said he, "but now let us see the final result at which he arrives." "It may be all very systematic," growled the superintendent, sorting out his papers, "but I tell you, sir, it's all bosh." The latter word he jerked out viciously, as he slapped down on the table the final product of the professor's labours. "There," he continued, "that's what he calls the full rendering, and I reckon it'll make your hair curl. It might be a message from Bedlam." Thorndyke took up the first sheet, and as he compared the constructed renderings with the literal translation, the ghost of a smile stole across his usually immovable countenance. "The meaning is certainly a little obscure," he observed, "though the reconstruction is highly ingenious, and moreover, I think the professor is probably right. That is to say, the words which he has supplied are probably the omitted parts of the passages from which the words of the cryptogram were taken. What do you think, Jervis?" He handed me the two papers, of which one gave the actual words of the cryptogram and the other a suggested reconstruction, with omitted words supplied. The first read, "Whip, noise, prey, robbery, lies, city. Woe, horse, wheel, rattling, darkness. Day, chariot, mountain, morning, darkness, cloud, gloominess, flame. Them, fire, strong, people." Turning to the second paper, I read out the suggested rendering. "Woe to the bloody city! It is full of lies and robbery. The prey departeth not. The noise of a whip, and the noise of the rattling of the wheels, and of the prancing horses, and of the jumping chariots. A day of darkness and of gloominess, a day of clouds and of thick darkness, as the morning spread upon the mountains, a great people and a strong. A fire devoureth before them, and behind them a flame burneth." Here the first sheet ended, and as I laid it down, Thorndyke looked at me inquiringly. "There is a good deal of reconstruction in proportion to the original matter," I objected. "The professor has supplied more than three-quarters of the final rendering." "Exactly," burst in the superintendent. "It's all professor and no cryptogram." "Still, I think the reading is correct," said Thorndyke, "as far as it goes, that is." "Good Lord!" exclaimed the dismayed detective. "Do you mean to tell me, sir, that all that balderdash is the real meaning of the thing?" "I don't say that," replied Thorndyke. "I say it is correct as far as it goes, but I doubt its being the solution of the cryptogram." "Have you been studying that photograph that I gave you?" demanded Miller with sudden eagerness. "I have looked at it," said Thorndyke evasively, "but I should like to examine the original if you have it with you." "I have," said the detective. "Professor Poppelbaum sent it back with the solution. You can have a look at it, though I can't leave it with you without special authority." He drew the document from his pocketbook and handed it to Thorndyke, who took it over to the window and scrutinized it closely. From the window he drifted into the adjacent office, closing the door after him, and presently the sound of a faint explosion told me that he had lighted the gas fire. "Of course," said Miller, taking up the translation again. "This gibberish is the sort of stuff you might expect from a parcel of crack-brained anarchists, but it doesn't seem to mean anything." "Not to us," I agreed, "but the phrases may have some prearranged significance. And then there are the letters between the words. It is possible that they may really form a cipher." "I suggested that to the professor," said Miller, "but he wouldn't hear of it. He is sure they are only dummies." "I think he is probably mistaken, and so, I fancy, does my colleague. But we shall hear what he has to say presently." "Oh, I know what he will say," growled Miller. "He will put the thing under the microscope and tell us who made the paper and what the ink is composed of, and then we shall be just where we are." The superintendent was evidently deeply depressed. We sat for some time pondering in silence on the vague sentences of the professor's translation, until at length Thorndyke reappeared, holding the document in his hand. He laid it quietly on the table by the officer, and then inquired, "Is this an official consultation?" "Certainly," replied Miller. "I was authorized to consult you respecting the translation, but nothing was said about the original. Still, if you want it for further study, I will get it for you." "No, thank you," said Thorndyke. "I have finished with it. My theory turned out to be correct." "Your theory?" exclaimed the superintendent eagerly. "Do you mean to say—" "And as you are consulting me officially, I may as well give you this." He held out a sheet of paper, which the detective took from him and began to read. "What is this?" he asked, looking up at Thorndyke with a puzzled frown. "Where did it come from?" "It is the solution of the cryptogram," replied Thorndyke. The detective reread the contents of the paper, and with the frown of perplexity deepening, once more gazed at my colleague. "This is a joke, sir. You are fooling me," he said sulkily. Nothing of the kind, answered Thorndyke. That is the genuine solution. But it is impossible, exclaimed Miller. Just look at it, Dr. Jervis. I took the paper from his hand, and as I glanced at it, I had no difficulty in understanding his surprise. It bore a short inscription in printed Roman capitals, thus: The Piccadilly stuff is up the chimbley, 416 Wardour Street, second floor back. It was hid because of old Moki's Jude. Moki is a blighter. Then that fellow wasn't an anarchist at all? I exclaimed. No, said Miller, he was one of Moki's gang. We suspected Moki of being mixed up with that job, but we couldn't fix it on him. By Jove, he added, slapping his thigh, if this is right, and I can lay my hands on the loot. Can you lend me a bag, Doctor? I'm off to Wardour Street this very moment. We furnished him with an empty suitcase, and from the window watched him making for Mitre Court at a smart double. I wonder if he will find the booty, said Thorndyke. It just depends on whether the hiding place was known to more than one of the gang. Well, it has been a quaint case, and instructive too. I suspect our friend Barton and the evasive Schönberg were the collaborators who produced that curiosity of literature. May I ask how you deciphered the thing? I said. It didn't appear to take long. It didn't. It was merely a matter of testing a hypothesis. And you ought not to have to ask that question, he added with marked severity, seeing that you had what turned out to have been all the necessary facts 2 days ago. But I will prepare a document and demonstrate to you tomorrow morning. So, Miller was successful in his quest, said Thorndyke as we smoked our morning pipes after breakfast. The entire swag, as he calls it, was up the chimbley undisturbed. He handed me a note which had been left with the empty suitcase by a messenger shortly before, and I was about to read it when an agitated knock was heard at our door. The visitor, whom I admitted, was a rather haggard and dishevelled elderly gentleman who, as he entered, peered inquisitively through his concave spectacles from one of us to the other. "Allow me to introduce myself, gentlemen," he said. "I am Professor Poppelbaum." Thorndyke bowed and offered a chair. "I called yesterday afternoon," our visitor continued, "at Scotland Yard, where I heard of your remarkable decipherment and of the convincing proof of its correctness. Thereupon I borrowed the cryptogram, and have spent the entire night in studying it, but I cannot connect your solution with any of the characters. I wonder if you would do me the great favour of enlightening me as to your method of decipherment, and so save me further sleepless nights? You may rely on my discretion." "Have you the document with you?" asked Thorndyke. The professor produced it from his pocketbook and passed it to my colleague. "You observe, Professor," said the latter, "that this is a laid paper and has no watermark?" "Yes, I noticed that." "And that the writing is in indelible Chinese ink?" "Yes, yes," said the savant impatiently. "But it is the inscription that interests me, not the paper and ink." "Precisely," said Thorndyke. "Now, it was the ink that interested me when I caught a glimpse of the document 3 days ago. Why, I asked myself, should anyone use this troublesome medium? For this appears to be stick ink, when good writing ink is to be had. What advantages has Chinese ink over writing ink? It has several advantages as a drawing ink, but for writing purposes it has only one. It is quite unaffected by wet. The obvious inference, then, was that this document was, for some reason, likely to be exposed to wet. But this inference instantly suggested another, which I was yesterday able to test, thus." He filled a tumbler with water, and rolling up the document, dropped it in. Immediately there began to appear on it a new set of characters of a curious grey colour. In a few seconds Thorndyke lifted out the wet paper and held it up to the light. Now there was plainly visible an inscription in transparent lettering, like a very distinct watermark. It was printed in Roman capitals, written across the other writing, and read: "The Piccadilly stuff is up the chimbley, 416 Wardour Street, second floor back. It was hid because of old Moki's Jude. Moki is a blighter." The professor regarded the inscription with profound disfavour. "How do you suppose this was done?" he asked gloomily. "I will show you," said Thorndyke. "I have prepared a piece of paper to demonstrate the process to Dr. Jervis. It is exceedingly simple." He fetched from the office a small plate of glass, and a photographic dish in which a piece of thin note paper was soaking in water. "This paper," said Thorndyke, lifting it out and laying it on the glass, "has been soaking all night and is now quite pulpy." He spread a dry sheet of paper over the wet one, and on the former wrote heavily with a hard pencil, "Moki is a blighter." On lifting the upper sheet, the writing was seen to be transferred in a deep grey to the wet paper, and when the latter was held up to the light, the inscription stood out clear and transparent as if written with oil. "When this dries," said Thorndyke, "the writing will completely disappear, but it will reappear whenever the paper is again wetted." The professor nodded. "Very ingenious," said he. A sort of artificial palimpsest, in fact. But I do not understand